Hello, my name is Paul Sandrock, ACTFL Director of Education. Welcome to this webinar, which is offered as part of ACTFL's response to the changed educational environment in which language educators find themselves at all levels these days. The move to teaching and learning remotely is challenging. ACTFL thanks all of you for the tremendous effort you are putting forth, staying focused on your learners and finding creative ways to support them during these times. Today's webinar is led by Rosen. Lauren directs the University of Wisconsin Collaborative Language Program, overseeing a blended learning model that combines video conferencing and web technologies to provide students across the university system with access to languages that would not be available to them through face-to-face instruction. Lauren strongly advocates thinking first about your assessments and appropriate tasks, and then determining how technology supports the most effective path to the learning goals. So now that you're teaching remotely, what are your questions? Here to answer them, welcome, Lauren.
Welcome, everybody. I know it's been a long day for all of you as we're all trying to figure out this remote learning and teaching environment in which we're in right now. So I appreciate you taking the time to be here with us and hopefully get your questions answered as best I can. So without further ado, I'm just going to go ahead and get started. So our first category, initial adjustment to teaching and learning remotely. I know that many of you have been teaching, 1, 2, 3 weeks. Some of you maybe not yet. Maybe next week is your first week based on where spring breaks and things fall. But what advice do I have to offer for the self-imposed pressure that we feel right now? The first thing I want to say is step away. I know that's really hard to do. Many of us are so dedicated to our profession that we tend to be working 24/7 anyway. But in this time, we really do need to step away and sort of rethink our outcomes, rethink our teaching, and then return to it. Think about what's really, really essential under these circumstances and adjust your syllabus, adjust your plans accordingly. You need to let go of the unnecessary. There may be, if you were to look at your face-to-face lessons, there may be items that scaffold and help support what you do, but they're also more just kind of for fun and not necessarily required. Or there may be, look at the can-do statements. There may be some extra things that you've thrown in that don't necessarily match up. Those might be some of the things that you could let go of. There really aren't best practices that we can talk about right now for this in the sense that none of us chose to be in this environment. So for those of you, for example, who are familiar with the TV series MASH, we're kind of like the educational version of MASH right now, where we're just sort of doing the best we can with what we have to work with, and it's not a perfect situation. You're not teaching an online course where you've had lots of training and your students have chosen to learn that way. So you need to just let go of that and be okay with the best that you can, whatever that best may be. Make sure you're taking some self-time. So create a schedule for yourself. You shouldn't be in front of your computer 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Schedule in time to take a walk, to get some fresh air, to do the laundry, to care for somebody at home that needs your help, to make dinner. All of those kinds of things still need to happen. And when you figure out what your schedule is going to look like, share that with your students. Let them know when they can expect you to be online. Let them know when they can expect, if they've emailed you a question, are you going to get back to them in 48 hours rather than 2 minutes? Let them know what to expect and make it very clear. And at the same time, give them that same grace. I would encourage you to ask them to create a similar schedule where they identify when they're going to be working on your course throughout the week. So, and have them share that with you so you know what sort of environment they're working in. I also added at the bottom of this particular slide a link to an adjusted syllabus statement. And it's not truly a syllabus, but it really, I think it really speaks well to the environment in which we're working. So I encourage you on your own when you have a chance to check out that link. People asked about what things to capitalize on with this new environment, with it being online and in many cases asynchronous only. So some things to think about. This is a great opportunity, synchronous or asynchronously, to bring in speakers from outside. Maybe you have colleagues or friends that are native speakers, or somebody overseas that you're connected to. This would be a great time to interview them using topics that are pertinent to your current curriculum. Whether that's a recorded interview or that's actually something you might do during synchronous time, that's something that is a whole lot easier to do actually in this environment than sometimes it is to do in your classroom environment, depending on the kinds of restrictions that your technology folks have put in your school district and that sort of thing. I would say in a lot of ways, it's actually easier, I think, to differentiate in this environment for your students. You can provide them multiple modes of learning content. So you can have a video, a website, their textbook, all of which teach the same grammar structure, for example. And they can pick and choose to learn it how they want, because we don't care so much how they learned it, we care that they learned it, and they can show us that through a form of assessment. And so different students can kind of pick and choose how they want to learn. When you're teaching that sort of thing in front of the class in a very traditional way, your students can't stop and start and rewind you when they go back to try and actually use what you were trying to teach them to do. So you can think about it that way. Slow down. You have more time and more space, so slow down. You don't need to do 5 scaffolding activities over one concept. Pick maybe 1 or 2 that would work well to convert into some sort of an asynchronous online environment. And focus on those and allow students to repeat them as many times as they want until they understand it, so that they can practice at their own pace. Doing things asynchronously really affords you that opportunity in a way that a classroom environment doesn't, because we always have those students that pick up things super quickly and the students that need that extra time. And this allows them to do everything as they feel most comfortable, and in the way that they feel most comfortable. If they can find comfort in learning remotely, which they didn't choose to do, I get that. Build in connections to what's actually happening in their lives and in their own homes. So when you're thinking about ways to incorporate what's going on with them in their lives, you can incorporate their families into it. Maybe they're going to be doing a project and they have a brother or sister that becomes part of some of the pictures or things. If you're dealing with elementary students, involve the parents. Those are, some ways that you can kind of not only connect the content to your students, but connect it to the family or to whomever they might be living with. If they're living with friends, they're college students, whatever the situation is. Start thinking about how you can connect the content to their current lives. Paul, were there any questions that I should hit before moving on to the next topic?
There you go. Yes, one issue is sort of an equity issue of access. And I know you're mainly talking about using the remote access, but just a quick word on the equity when some students may not have at-home access to internet, to those resources. I know districts are working really hard to address that, but anything, I'm sure that you occasionally come upon that problem.
Yeah, exactly. So that is a problem that you are correct that a lot of the districts are trying to address the best they can. I know here in Madison, Wisconsin, they're actually mailing out Chromebooks to students and things like that. For the most part, if the student doesn't have some form of technology, the parent probably at least has a phone, so that you can do some activities that way. You can also have students doing things that are just, on paper, and when they're done, have a parent take a picture of it and send it to you via email if that's the only way that they can connect to you. So a lot of it really is thinking outside the box. And don't think about them having to always be on the technology in order to interact. Those are certainly options. But if you do find yourself in a situation where not everybody in your class has access, start thinking a little bit outside the box. Another recommendation I have would be to contact whoever it is in your district or your institution that deals with accessibility and issues of disability. They may have some suggestions for how you can alter something to fit, while it might not be a physical disability or a mental disability of this person, but it's the disability of access. They may be able to help you with some options as well, but it's a lot of thinking outside the box. All right, so collaboration, some suggestions to maintain relationships, teacher to student and student to student. If you are using some form of technology like a learning management system, which I know is going to be more maybe in the 6 through 16 or 20 area than elementary school, there's typically a way that students are uploaded into the system, and ask them to fill out their profile picture, add themselves and any information they're comfortable with sharing. This is a closed, secure environment that you have to log into, but just having a face. Fortunately, all of you have had face-to-face classes, so your students have already built up some level of rapport with each other and connection with each other. And I'm pretty sure at this point, they're craving the opportunity to be with peers. So do things like uploading that profile picture and ways to connect the content to them personally so that they can share about themselves. You can bring humor into it. Activities don't have to be serious all the time. In fact, a friend of mine, Natalie, who's a teacher in Georgia, she had students looking at museums, virtual museums, and choosing artwork that they liked. And then their job was to recreate that artwork physically with objects around their house and take a picture of themselves. And then they had a series of follow-up activities with certain questions they had to answer about the original work of art, both orally and written activities. And what I really liked about that is we need to be thinking or working smarter, not harder. She took that same activity and she just adjusted it for different levels that she teaches. So it wasn't finding a completely new activity for each one of her sections. It was repurposing one to build on the language skills that they would have as they were at a higher level of proficiency. So thinking along those lines to make things easier. Discussion boards, there's a lot of talk about discussion boards. I know a lot of people have used Flipgrid, which is a video-based discussion board. So those are all options. When you're doing those, again, students are craving that connection. And so to get those to work in a more collaborative way with ongoing communication, do something that connects the use of language to themselves. Some ideas might be a group story where maybe you'd have different prompts, or just a couple of prompts, and you divide the students into groups, and each group has a person who starts with the prompt and maybe writes a sentence or a paragraph or however much they can based on their level. and then somebody else kicks in and you create sort of a group story. You can do the 2 truths and a lie, where they listen to each other or read each other's 2 truths and a lie and try and guess which one is the lie. There's finding a perfect roommate or a perfect date, where you describe who would be perfect for you to live with or to go out with, and then the other students have to listen to that and choose who they would want to live with or go out with. You can do the same thing with like students could pretend that they are the perfect chef and what they would do as a perfect chef, what kinds of foods they would make and in their restaurant. And then the other students would determine whose restaurant they would want to go to and have to explain why. Or any other type of employment. They can make it up completely, but just getting them using the language based around the themes that you're doing and personalizing it. Let's see, I'm looking at some of the other questions that were asked in this category. Synchronous communications do typically involve a turn taking. So it's not, even in a synchronous kind of environment, and some of you may have already experienced this, because of that turn taking, it's not as natural as face-to-face communication. Be okay with that. Rather than stressing about what isn't working or doesn't feel comfortable, let go of the fact that that's how it is and determine, what do you want to do to move forward about that? Do you want to just be comfortable with it and keep doing synchronous communication? Do you want to drop synchronous communication already? Things that you can't change, you just need to determine how you want to move forward with them as they are. This is, like I said, not what any of us planned on. We're a MASH unit trying to figure out how to do the best we can in circumstances that are outside of our control. So that you really need to let go of that control. There were questions about grading and things like that. Provide spaces for students to share their experience in ungraded spaces or no stakes spaces. So you can give them prompts related to their life right now if you want to help get them to have discussions, or just make an open space where they feel that they can write whatever they want, even in English and not the target language, just to have a place to let go of all of the angst that they're perhaps experiencing right now. In that though, there's the question of whether or not they're still connected. So you can have an exit ticket every day that can just be a personal reflection of some kind, whether it's a reflection on the lesson where they can tell you, boy, I still have questions about X, or it's a reflection that says, this was really confusing for me, or I really like this and that, or just I'm feeling overwhelmed right now. Anything that gives you some form of feedback. So if you're doing mostly low or no stakes things, something that lets you know that they're still there. And if you don't hear from somebody for a couple of days when you had something like that, that's when you can reach out to them personally. It's never too much communication. So you can reach out to them personally and say, hey, I noticed you didn't, turn in the last 2 exit tickets. Are you okay? Is there anything I can do to help? All of these practices, I believe, to some extent are really relevant whether you're teaching face-to-face or online. They can be helpful because it's really all about your connection and communication with your students. Go to the next one. Engagement. Which are the best strategies to keep students motivated? So I talked a little bit about that just a minute ago. To go a little bit further, be human. Acknowledge the weirdness in which we're living right now and share your experience with your students and allow them to share that back with you. Be empathetic. Practice kindness to yourself and understanding as well as to them for what they're experiencing and what their family situations might be right now. frankly, it would be wonderful if everybody went home to a wonderful household with supportive parents that could help them in all of their studies. But the reality is there are students that went home and don't have that life, and actually going to school felt like the one safe place to them. So you're going to have a variety of students that you're working with, and making sure that you have that human connection with them so that they can share will go a long way to keeping them engaged and motivated about doing the content for your class. To know if they're engaged, like I said, having some sort of daily interaction where they have to submit something to you so that you know that they're there. That will also let you know, some of our students may be getting sick, or maybe taking care of a sick family member. And when you stop seeing or hearing from them and you check in with them, that's when you can find that out and give them a little bit of grace. Hopefully this won't happen to any of you, but you all might find yourselves ill and need to take some time. And it's okay to do that. And it's okay to let your students know that that's what you need to do right now. If you can, have a couple, 2 to 3 weeks worth of content kind of pushed out ahead of time, that will help you should that happen to you. But those are all things we all need to, that's our reality right now. You can never reach out too much or communicate too often with your students. So really, I can't emphasize that enough, that you really need to reach out. And that goes, again, things that are good for face-to-face. The more communication you have with the students and their families, the more engaged they become in your course. You might be that one teacher that noticed and reached out to them. So I encourage you to do that. People were asking about interactive games and things for engaging students. If you were already somebody who used interactive games in your classroom, most of those can also be done asynchronously. You just put a time limit on it. You tell your students, you have between the next 24 hours or whatever it is to respond, and then build off of it into the next activity, just like you would have in your classroom. It's going to be slower because you have to wait for all of that data to come in before you can build off of it. Whereas in class, maybe it's, 5 minutes of the game, and then you have your content to build off of immediately. So you might have to shift some things around, but a lot of that can still be done asynchronously. You may find that you actually get more interaction from some individuals who tended to be more quiet in your classroom. They may be a little bit shy about using the target language in front of their peers because for whatever reason, they feel embarrassed. So you might see that some students become more engaged in this environment than they were in the face-to-face environment. So play with it and see what happens. My sense is that if you have a student that was completely disengaged before all this happened, you're not going to suddenly be able to engage them. They are most likely going to remain disengaged. The ones who have been engaged all along, you will be able to keep them going as long as you're continuing to have those open lines of communication and constantly connecting with them and connecting the content to them so it becomes meaningful. Be careful about synchronous sessions. Don't plan, if you teach 45-minute classes or 50-minute classes, don't plan a 50-minute synchronous session for your students. That's too long. I would recommend, you do 15 to 20-minute segments. If you have a larger class, consider breaking it up and doing, 2 or 3 different 15 to 20-minute segments, and let them sign up for which period of time they want to sign up for. But keeping those shorter, I think, will be more effective. And looking at your lesson plans to determine which kinds of engagement are really essential to have in a synchronous environment, and use that synchronous environment specifically for those activities. So do whatever pre-prepping that students need the scaffolding in order to be successful in that synchronous environment. And then also make sure that you follow up that synchronous environment with something where you're pulling from the content that happened there and continuing on. So it's not just sitting out there on its own. That said, if you haven't been doing any synchronous environments yet and you want to do some and you're not sure about it and you're not comfortable, it's okay to have the first couple as just sort of a check-in that could even be in a combination of English and the target language. It doesn't really matter, but sort of a way for students to come in, check out the environment, play with it, play a little bit with the language, and get comfortable in it before it becomes a regular part of your teaching. I know where I'm living here in Wisconsin, a lot of schools aren't intending to come back at all before the end of the year, which means we have from now until the middle of June to be doing this, which gives us lots of time to sort of figure out what this is going to look like and work through what makes the most sense. And if you do synchronous at all, be aware that there may be some students that can't join you, and that should be okay. So you can record them, record the sessions so they can watch it offline if they have that availability. But I'd be careful about putting some sort of graded assessment on what you're doing in a synchronous environment. Go on.
Yeah, Lauren, thank you so much. And a comment that was shared is so appreciating that it's not the technology, it's the tasks, and really appreciating you starting this with the emphasis on collaboration, engagement, and above all, the relationships. Our students need that as much as our teachers do. Thank you.
Absolutely. Okay, so interpersonal communication. How can I best support learners to maintain that? So there are a lot of ways to do interpersonal communication, both written and spoken. And the trickiest part with it in an asynchronous environment is when people are really looking for that spontaneity piece. This is where there is a technology that I do need to mention. It's called Extempore, and they have allowed for people to use that through, I believe, the end of the semester for free to get your feet wet and how it works. It is spontaneous asynchronous communication. It's the only tool that I have seen in 25 years that does anything like that. So if you're looking for oral and or if you're looking for spoken language, it can be done video or just oral recordings, and you need that spontaneity that you get with interpersonal communication, that's a great tool to look into. Other ways you can do it, which are significantly more low tech, pretty much everybody has a phone. If you have a Google Voice number, you can use that, and then you don't have to give students your cell phone number or home phone number. And what that does is it allows you to put a prompt out there, like a answering machine recording. Students call in, they hear your prompt, they have to respond to it right away and hang up. And if you don't tell them the prompt ahead of time, you just tell them, you be prepared to talk about X, but they don't know the exact prompt, then you're going to get spontaneous communication from them. Note that and tell them that you will know if they called and hung up and called back. So they, in a way that for the people who might be concerned about cheating, that might help with that a little bit. The other piece of that is if you know, and this goes for written as well as spoken communication. So at first, a lot of people looked at Flipgrid, which is a video-based discussion board, or in general, discussion boards can oftentimes in a way lean more towards presentational, in that students are able to sort of rehearse or practice and revise before they post. and then it kind of gets away from that spontaneity of interpersonal. But if you tell students, this is the kind of communication that I'm looking for, I'm not expecting 100% accuracy from you, I just want your ideas, that will help with getting that interpersonal communication. And if you happen to be lucky enough to be working in a learning management system, a lot of those allow you to open certain areas with timers, which will prevent students from being there too long. So those are some ways to get around that. The best kinds of prompts for discussions or any sort of interpersonal communication are going to be the ones that connect with your students personally and lead to some sort of emotional response. If you know, a yes/no question isn't going to get you much discussion, but if you're asking them what they think or what they feel and why, you're going to get much more out of it, or out of them, around whatever the topic is. If you're using rubrics to sort of assess how well they're doing, share that rubric with the students ahead of time. I wouldn't recommend counting interactions. What you're looking for is quality interactions, not quantity interactions. So getting points for more substantive responses is the direction that you want to go. For novice learners, give them lots of scaffolding ahead of time so that they're really prepared. You could even consider giving them sort of A and B sheets, which you could email to them if you wanted to do low tech, where A has certain information and B has other information, and they need to communicate in order to complete it. We all do those kinds of activities in our classroom, and there's no reason why that can't be done in an asynchronous format. You can even do up to 4 people, A, B, C, and D kind of content where they have to collaborate and connect in an asynchronous or synchronous way, talking to each other to be able to fill out that information. Class management. Any suggestions to deal with challenging moments in a remote classroom? Have a sense of humor, especially if the challenging moment is when the technology isn't working the way that you wanted or that you hoped that it would. So we're all going to face these just like we do in a face-to-face classroom. You're going to come across things that aren't going to work the way that you want them to. I would be sort of careful and conscientious about what that might look like on your students' end. So that's where having a schedule for your students so that they know where to be when, if you need them to do something synchronously, but also giving them the grace to not be there if they can't. And creating a schedule for yourself that you share with your students and your students' schedule shared with you, so that you have sort of a overall view of what can and can't happen and when. If you haven't already surveyed your students to find out what they have access to, they may have a computer, but they may also have 1 computer for their house and 3 siblings and 2 parents, all of whom need to use it. So trying to manage that is going to be something that you're not going to have control over. So being comfortable with chaos, I guess. And I think to some extent, language educators are comfortable with chaos, because that's kind of what our face-to-face classrooms look like. When we've got students practicing and doing all kinds of things, there's a whole lot more energy oftentimes that's happening in our classrooms than in other disciplines. And so just take what you remember about being comfortable with that chaos, and know that that's going to happen online too. By shortening the synchronous sessions, you'll have more control over it. And you might have smaller groups, which will also help control some of that. If you haven't experienced this yet and you're just assuming there's going to be an issue, I'm going to guess that the issues will be more on the technological end than on the actual managing your students end. But be sure to tell them ahead of time, these are my expectations. When we're in this environment, this is how you need to behave. And this is what we're expecting to have happen. If you find that they're not able to handle it, then just don't do synchronous communication and stick to asynchronous. A lot of institutions are only doing asynchronous anyway, just because of the difficulties of students getting on. If students aren't completing their work and you're having trouble with that, ask yourself if that student was always turning in their work before you went to a remote environment. If so, then that's definitely a student you need to be reaching out to and say, hey, what's going on? If it's a student that never turned in their work earlier this year anyway, I don't think that now that they're supposedly learning remotely that you can suddenly expect them to be turning in all of their work to you. Some may surprise you, but don't change that. If they were doing one thing before, they're not likely to do it differently now. I will share a sample schedule with you that was sent out by our local school district so that you can see what that looks like when you fill out sort of time slots. That includes self-time, keeping you from spending too much time online and keeping your students from spending too much time online. That's something that I'll have to share outside of here. Okay, feedback and grading. What are some of the effective and efficient ways to give students feedback for their work? So first, keep in mind that a letter grade in and of itself isn't really giving students specific constructive feedback. It's giving them a grade because that's what we're supposed to be doing, but specific constructive feedback is going to be more pointed to exactly what they did well and what they can improve on. I would consider using, if you haven't seen them before, single point rubrics. There's a whole bunch of resources out there, including images of some single point rubrics. The idea behind it is the first column, you can put areas of improvement. The second column is where you have your rubric criteria. And the third column is where you can describe how a student exceeded whatever the standard was that you were looking for, or the expectation that you were looking for. That's going to give them far more feedback in and of itself than just a grade. So consider that. Consider a lot of just low stakes reinforcement kinds of things. So if you do any online concept checks, maybe you're only giving them a check for having completed it, but within that, if it's sort of a quiz, concept check quiz where it's not graded, but it gives them feedback, that can be a way for them to know whether or not they're understanding the material that they're trying to learn on their own. And that also gives you, at the end of it, I would suggest you put a reflective question so that they're able to tell you if there's something that they still really aren't understanding. And then you can go back and you can provide more resources for that. I encourage you every day in some way or another to be asking students to reflect on their learning so you have a good idea of where they're at. That's really going to be key right now to you figuring out what materials you still need to provide them. Okay, so plans for 2020, unit and lesson planning. You can pretty much throw anything you planned out the window because it's not going to look the same as the way you originally planned it. But if you're familiar with the expression that life is what happens after you make other plans, I think that's kind of what we're living in right now. Some ideas to adapt your lessons and your unit goals, but still build on proficiency. One of the most common problems that I see, and I see this even with people who are going through full training with with a purposeful intent of teaching a course online is the creation of a course and a half. So be careful, and I kind of said this at the beginning, don't take your lesson and just try and put the whole thing online. You need to really go back to those can-do statements and identify what is it that students need to be able to do, and really make sure that every activity, that every chunk of content that you're providing for them and everything you're asking them to do is tied directly to one of those can-do statements. And rather than doing 5 activities to practice it, maybe you're going to do 2 or 3. Make sure that they have a chance that they can maybe repeat those scaffolding parts that prepare them. Remember that your students, especially, you know, if they're in the 6th grade and above category, they have multiple classes that they're taking. So it's not just your class. They can't dedicate their entire day just to your Japanese class. So be careful about too much information. And again, that could be a reflection, especially as you're first getting started. After they've gone through it a week or so, ask them, how much time are you spending on my course? Or at the end of a day, how long did it take you to complete this? Just to give you an idea of what kind of time they're actually spending. I want to make sure that I hit all of the questions. If you're familiar with flipping lessons, one of the great things that you learn in flipping lessons is how to chunk your information. So if you're creating a video lesson, for example, make it 5 to 8 minutes long maximum, and then have some concept check questions about that one concept. Don't teach all the entire structure together at once. Chunk it into segments and ask specific questions about each of those segments. And then at the end, you can do, you know, after you've done some scaffolding activities, you can do a larger assessment that incorporates all of those pieces. So kind of, you know, that's all part of the scaffolding. Your students aren't going to sit and listen to a 50-minute lecture by you. So kind of get that out of your mind as anything that you might be trying to do with the time that you have. Remember that even in your face-to-face classes, you didn't probably always finish your lessons. And it's quite possible that the part that was at the end of your lesson was the part where your students really take time to demonstrate what they know and can do with the language, okay? So you may be spreading out what is a one-day lesson in a face-to-face class where you didn't even finish what was happening at the end. That may spread out across 2 or 3 days in an online format, but you're going to get to that performance assessment that you have at the end where they demonstrate what they can actually do after having practiced it for a while. It's not about how many chapters of your textbook you get through. It's about how well your students can actually use the language that they have. So that goes back to kind of refocusing and rethinking what your syllabus looks like. Okay, assignments and homework. What do I need to keep in mind when creating assignments or homework tasks? So you could consider, I call it the 30-15 model, where you've got maybe 30 minutes of learning new content and 15 minutes of students actively working with it and submitting it, which also could get flip-flopped to 30 minutes of students working on content and submitting it with 15 minutes of new learning in a day. So, you know, that's basically 45 minutes, which, you know, some of your students are going to take a little bit longer and some of your students are going to take less time to do it. And that's where it kind of spreads across multiple days. And one of the things, going back to what you can capitalize on in this environment, is that ability of the students to take more time where they need it, when they need it, and students to go through more quickly the things that they just get right away. Again, asking them to reflect at the end of every assignment, I really encourage that to help you know that what you're doing is helpful. Create activities where you're asking them to go outside. Create activities where they have to gather things from around their house. Create activities that require movement of some kind, so they're not just staring at the screen all day. And you shouldn't be staring at the screen all day either. But actually incorporate, one of the great things I think about teaching language is that we're teaching everyday life skills and everyday life experiences. So your vocabulary may change. You may not be following textbook vocabulary anymore because that's not the context in which your student's experience is right now. So maybe you're going to bring in a whole new set of vocabulary around how they're spending their days. What's it like to have, to try and learn when you've got your little brother or sister tugging on your leg, or your dog wanting to take a walk, or your cat walking across your computer, whatever it is. You can incorporate some of those things. For students who maybe are more tactile, whether they've got technology or not, it's okay to have them handwrite things. Then they can take a picture of it and send it to you in whatever way you're having them submit content. Or maybe you're teaching a language like Arabic or Chinese or Japanese or Russian, where writing is a big part of it. And so that's a skill that you've been working on. So again, it's okay to have them handwrite things and then submit a photo to you. Provide them with options for turning things in. Some people might turn it in as a photo. Other people might do a whole assignment digitally. So you can be flexible about what you're allowing them to do as far as getting assignments and homework turned in. Okay, assessments. What are some of the most effective ways to assess the 3 modes of communication? So I actually like online speaking assessments a lot. I like them because it gives me the opportunity to really hear an individual student. When you're, wandering around the class and listening to groups, yes, you pick up on a lot and you support the students as they're going, and you get a general feel for common difficulties and that sort of thing. But when I really want to hear a specific student, that's where, kind of like one-on-one oral assessment goes. But now these recorded assessments, you can do all of them without you having to be there. And some of the technologies that were mentioned earlier, VoiceThread, Flipgrid, Extempore, they all will allow you to do that. Extempore is, like I said, the online asynchronous but spontaneous communication, whereas Flipgrid and VoiceThread can be more viewed as presentational discussion, depending on how you set it up. There are tons and tons of resources for listening activities, where then you can create even a Google form as a interpretive assessment. If you happen to already be a user of PlayPosit or H5P integrated into videos, or any number of other technologies that are out there. Kaltura does some of that. There's a gazillion ones out there. You can do sort of listening checks with those. I don't recommend you start jumping into a whole bunch of new technologies right now, though. Get your course kind of under control, know what it is that you're going to be teaching, and the format, more importantly, the format that can be consistent across weeks. And once you get to that, where you have a comfortable pace and your students are comfortable with what you're doing, then start adding in a technology or two to help support some of these. But interpretive and presentational have always been the easiest ones to do, actually, I think, online. It's the spontaneity of the interpersonal that was complicated until extemporary came around. You can use timers to help with the interpersonal. As I mentioned earlier, some of the learning management systems allow that, or just trust your students. You can tell when they're reading something. So trust your students, tell them, I only want you to spend 2 minutes on this activity, and have them provide you what they can in 2 minutes, and you'll know if they're reading it. So make sure you tell them ahead of time what your expectations are. Give them a rubric if you want to give them a rubric, but make sure that they know you're not looking for accuracy. You're looking for how well can they share their ideas.
As I look through some of the other questions, activities to recommend for increasing student discourse. Any more you might want to say about that? It seems that that idea of not losing the interactivity, sort of maintaining at least where students are, and so they don't backslide,
Right.
seems to be a concern.
And a lot of that is actually in posing the right kind of questions. There are a number of resources out on the web about how to pose good discussion questions so that students really do interact. So that's one place to look if you're not sure how to ask those kinds of questions. But again, go back to your face-to-face environment and look at the kinds of pair activities that you were going to do in your class, and just sort of rethink, how can I turn this activity into something that could be done online? So you don't have to reinvent the wheel entirely. The other piece of that, I think, is we have a huge network of language educators. It looks like there's around 150 of you right now on this call. Stay connected and ask questions. You're not in this alone, and there's no reason for any one person to reinvent the entire wheel. If you're lucky enough to have great colleagues in a department, ask them. Even if they're not in your language, they're probably teaching a similar thing in their language, whatever their language might be. So collaborate with them and talk about it. Don't isolate yourself. Make sure that you're having a community around you as well, so that you're not alone in this.
That's so helpful. Thank you. There was a question also about ways to get students to reflect that are quick and easy, that maybe I could do. You've given a few ideas of some exit tickets and other things, but other reflection ways to engage them in really thinking about their own learning.
So in addition to the ones that I had already said, you can even ask things like, do you feel that you could teach this to a peer? If so, or if not, what do you still need? And it's okay to have the reflections in English. I think I might have said that before, because that's really, I think those are the things that will help you shape your lessons and really know what the students still need. I feel like there are some good resources also on the web about reflective questions. So that would be a good place to look.
One final question I might just ask is if you have any advice for the world of American Sign Language in an online environment.
Yeah, so actually, I don't know, maybe 12 or 15 years ago, I was working with an ASL teacher who actually really, and this was obviously no need to be online, but she really liked the way VoiceThread worked at the time for sign language. And she used it in a variety of ways. One of the things that VoiceThread does really well is it allows you to upload almost any kind of content as a prompt. So you can put PowerPoint in there, you can put a PDF file, you can do all kinds of different content. And she would have students record themselves signing what they were reading. There were other instances where she was signing, and I think that they had to speak what she signed. So she used it in a variety of ways. That seems to be a really good tool for that. Of course, if you can do synchronous, you could do some synchronous activities using something like Zoom or any number of other Google Hangouts, Collaborate Ultra. Sign language is definitely tougher because that visual is really required. So I'm outside of something like VoiceThread that does the video, or extempore for assessing it. It's a tougher area for sure. Those are the main ones that I would think of for asynchronous instructional uses, I think.
Lauren, thank you. This has been fantastic. People are freely sharing a lot of resources in the chat box now as well. Just a quick summary that I'm hearing is people appreciating the reminder to keep thinking about simplicity and flexibility. And one teacher wrote in, "Thank you for giving us permission to only do what is essential. I needed to hear that."
Yes.
So I don't know if you have a final word before I do.
Just, thank you all for taking the time. Feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to help the best I can as you go down this journey, which may be longer than any of us want it to be. But know that you're not alone. I'm here, and there's a whole community of other educators out there for you as well.
Absolutely. Well, Lauren, thank you for such an informative webinar. I know every language educator is very grateful for your reassurance to be realistic as we try to teach in this virtual environment.
Right.
The practical tips are super helpful. Your examples, I know, are going to be implemented a lot in the classes in the weeks ahead. To every language educator, thank you for all you are doing for your learners today and every day. Your learners need you now more than ever. So please continue to visit www.acfl.org. You'll see announcements for additional upcoming webinars to support you in your work. And we thank you for learning with ACFL.